Well, it was important because I wanted to find the right setting and the right place to have my show. There was a lot of different places who were interested in taking the series, but I thought kweliTV would be the right source, particularly since it, cultivates Black culture. It was one of the first streaming, networks, and since I, am doing a show of this nature, and it's my first, I thought it'd be a great idea to place it on Kweli. Black Music Month had a lot to do with it as well. And I knew I was getting toward the end of the month, but I needed to make a decision. And I thought that it would be right on time with Black Music Month. The fact that I'm doing TV One's Unsung and known as an R&B historian, I thought it was just perfect timing. Part of it, to me, part of the reason is because R&B music has dissipated to some degree. We don't see a lot of R&B groups anymore. In fact, there hasn't been an R&B group that has been nominated for a Grammy in over 20 years. And part of the reason is because, those kind of groups are missing now. We don't see R&B groups as we used to with Harmony. And part of the reason we don't see that is because we don't need, that a lot of people no longer need the A&R and all of the push, behind them in order to succeed. Back in the day, you needed a whole lot of people behind you. Now you could just be a YouTube or a TikTok video away from being a superstar. It is to some degree. I think part of the reason that it's still alive is because a lot of the music is being sampled still by a lot of artists. But the other part requires that it takes 3 or 4 people to feel the same way about doing music. And it's difficult to find people in doing it that way anymore. In other words, if you have a group, it takes 4 or 5 of you to feel the same way, think the same way, dance the same way, harmonize the same way, feel the same way about your sense of direction and purpose. And you don't find that very much anymore. I would say between the 80s, I think the 80s it reached its climax, although there was a sense of resurgence of R&B music, particularly in the 90s. But rap music was slowly creeping into the culture of R&B music, and it was difficult to deny it. And what happened is that people were taking the old music and bringing it into the new way with rap. And so I would say in the late 80s and the early 90s, it particularly caught its last wind. It's hard to really say. It would require, as I mentioned earlier, for 4 or 5 people to think the same and push themselves out. It's one of the reasons why old school R&B groups are so prevalent, and how people gravitate toward the old or the parts of yesterday. We don't see the dedication of many people anymore of just wanting to do R&B. It requires you to, when you're a group, it required you to be much more than just an R&B singer. Well, first I began with, I got mentored by Casey Kasem of American Top 40. He was the one who told me that, in fact, I needed to change. I actually knew the pop chart better, but he thought that it would be better for me to learn the R&B charts, because he believed that R&B would never be the same. In the late, I think it was the early 2000s when we met in the early 2000s, and he was telling me that it would be a great idea for me to learn the R&B charts. And slowly but surely, I got really well at not only learning the charts, but learning the history of the artist. And being on Unsung for the last 10 years, doing many of their episodes, that's helped me a great deal in understanding, not just the charts, but the history of R&B. And being able to do a documentary as well, an audio documentary, to help me as well of learning where R&B really came from. For example, many people don't know, but music really began with slavery, and the slaves would sing, but the slave masters would tell them that they weren't allowed to sing because they were forbidden to sing, because of the fact they believed that they were trying to escape and were singing in code. And that's where R&B music began. So the history of R&B is something that's very important. More importantly, knowing the charts. And of course, being able to do the bios of many different artists has helped me a great deal. If I have to think about that, and he was truly my idol, I have to really say his sense of being able to tell a story. When I was a kid in Cincinnati, Ohio, I would listen to him, and I was always fascinated by the fact that he would be able to tell you a story about a particular artist. And to this very day, particularly from the 70s, when I would listen to him, I still know some of them by heart. And it's amazing to me because people really love hearing trivia. It's a big deal. And it brings them back to a time of yesteryear. And that's what I learned from him. Show the glory, but tell the story. This is so hard. I almost want to go through different decades, but I'll say from the 60s to the 90s. In the 60s, it was James Brown. In the 70s, it was the Jackson 5 and the Stylistics. I got to throw them in. A lot of these people are friends, so I got to make sure I put them in there. Although there were many in the 70s. In the 80s, I would, no question, have to say Stevie Wonder. And in the 90s, I'm going to say, but not by much, I would say Mariah Carey. If I really had to put my finger on it, I would definitely say the group, the Jackson 5, were really underrated. Out of 26 singles, 24 of their singles reached the top 10. And that's unheard of for any group, particularly in the 70s, in the decade of the 70s. But another underrated artist was Stephanie Mills, who was just below Aretha Franklin from being the #1 female artist of the 1980s. I just finished, as I said last year, I wrote the book, The Four Seasons of R&B, which went to #1, a couple of times over the last year or so, still in the top 10, which is really great. And I'm so appreciative of that. And of course, the series, The Four Seasons of R&B, I can be reached at my Instagram at Tyrone DuBose. You can also reach me on Facebook or on my website at randbhistorian.com. Also on Slow Jams Live every Saturday on my Instagram, I do music history. About 1.5 minutes of music history of the charts, and I talk about a particular artist or some trivia that people have sent.